I'm Jaden Jefferson here, and I'm right now joined by Dr. Brianna Mack. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and Government at Ohio Wesleyan University. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's kind of just start by recapping what happened today. So, the Supreme Court ruled to kind of limit the power of those lower federal courts. And this is a big deal, obviously, because in these first few months of the Trump administration, a lot of his policies have ended up in court. And we've seen that those courts would sometimes block those policies. What do you make of this? What is the change this now has in terms of his power as president?
Well, we shouldn't be too surprised that the Supreme Court ruled the way that they did. It's a 6-3 split among ideological lines. And of course, that six are for the conservative justices, while those three are the more liberal leaning ones. And it's important to note that today's ruling didn't necessarily invalidate birthright citizenship. What it did was make it a bit easier for the Trump administration, and in particular for ICE, to round up folks whose immigration status is a bit questionable. And so by removing the injunctions, right, it made it so that folks who are targeted or at risk through this, through these new immigration challenges, they have to file their own lawsuits with the federal government. And so I argue that this injunction ruling is intersectional on almost four aspects. So there, of course, is your immigration status. There's also education, because what if, you don't have enough education to realize that you need to get a lawyer? There's also socioeconomic status, right? Lawyers and going through the court system is expensive. And then this fourth aspect, there is an implicit racial aspect to this as well. Because if you're thinking about who is much more likely, or which racial groups are much more likely to have access to the resources to do these challenges, we know that folks of color are much more likely to be targeted, as well as, struggle navigating the judicial system.
And I'm glad you made that distinction about birthright citizenship, because a lot of people assume that this was about strictly birthright citizenship, when this is generally about the power of courts, and birthright citizenship could very well fall into that category. And I do think it's also important to note that we have these precedents that are set by federal courts, where if one court decides this is how something should be interpreted, that standard is applied to the entire country. Presidents throughout history have battled with federal courts, but now we're seeing that these courts are starting to lose that power. So how complex could this get, where you have individual courts making decisions over specific jurisdictions?
And so like that was the biggest issue with this ruling, because if you remove the birthright citizenship aspect of it, it is kind of problematic if you have access to the proper lawyers who know the proper people, and they can eventually, essentially shop around which district and which, set of judges that they should present their case to. It's like, I liken it to going up for your driver's license as a teenager. You won't take your driver's test in the big city. You will actually take it in a rural area, because it's going to be an easier test in a rural area than it's going to be in the city. And so, today's ruling made it so that folks can't take it to the rural setting anymore. They have to go to the district that's closest to them. But once that, like I said, is being removed, it, in theory, if we didn't have to worry about, all of the cross-cutting authoritarian changes that the Trump administration is trying to do, you would say, oh, this ruling makes sense. It streamlines everything and makes the judicial process a bit more equitable for all. But, these are unprecedented times, as I tell my students. And so this type of ruling, along with when we're thinking about the presidential immunity that was granted, last year, a year before last, it is setting things up for a very unpleasant couple of years.
Obviously, going around to different courts can be a big struggle in terms of an issue like birthright citizenship, because if one state says that's fine and another state says it's not, it won't work. And we saw that the court decided today not to offer an opinion on birthright citizenship, which is in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Why do you think that is?
I think they didn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, because they know that there's an expectation to address it. I think the 14th Amendment is like a Jenga tower. And unfortunately, at its base, there are only 2 blocks left. And there's an expectation you're going to have to pull one of those blocks. If you pull that block, we know what what's more than likely going to happen. It's going to fall apart, and pigs will fly, fire and brimstone will rain down, because you are challenging the very specific aspect of American identity and American citizenship that has been in place since the abolition of slavery. And so if you remove that or try to redefine what that citizenship is, you put everybody at risk, not just immigrants, not just people of color, everybody. And at that point, it's no longer, a good thing, or American citizenship is no longer this attractive thing that you want to attain.
So really, it seems that the justices, if I'm reading this correctly, they did not want to do that because it would cause uncertainty, which is something that may have been wanted in this decision today.
Absolutely. But still, with today's ruling, it does make it a lot harder for folks who are of lower socioeconomic status or of lower education.
We talk often about presidential power. You mentioned earlier that presidential immunity ruling of 2024 by the court. Given what is out now unfolded today, is President Donald Trump maybe the most powerful president this country has elected?
Yes. Um, so, for a very long time, the most powerful president, I argued, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the one that changed a lot of our American government and even the way society functions, created a lot of programs and stuff that are still in use today. Hello, Social Security, right?
Right.
And of course, he did that with 4 terms. It's his fault that we have the 2-term limits, because he was in office 16 years. So, for the longest time, he held the record for being the most powerful president. And of course, he was also president, if I recall correctly, no, not wartime, maybe a little bit during wartime, World War II. Anyways, the point is, he was in there a very, very long time. Trump, in now this second term, has shaken the table, flipped it, chopped it up, and he's trying to burn it. And the amount of changes and things that he wants to do with the federal government seems like, seemingly overnight. But, if you read Project 2025, we know this is par for the course. But absolutely. And the reason that he's able to make all of these changes so quickly, the reason why he's able to, appoint all of these folks, even folks that, seemingly have no qualifications or even experience to be in those positions, I would argue is a direct result of this presidential immunity. And so even if, things change, right, or even if, for the next president, right, we still have this dangerous precedent thanks to this presidential immunity, which, essentially will give presidents carte blanche to do whatever they want to do. And that is a very dangerous precedent that now exists.
And we saw in the court opinion today, they said that federal courts may have the ability to decide on certain things for the entire country under certain circumstances, but they didn't define what those circumstances were. So given that, how do courts approach their job differently from when they did just earlier in the morning?
Well, so, we also have the 30-day, this ruling won't go into effect until, almost August, right? And so that gives folks enough time to, do their work and try to plan out their legal strategies. But by being purposefully vague, it indicates that there will, when instances arise and it doesn't seem clear, the expectation is that the Supreme Court will step in. But we know that's a little problematic, because we know in general, the Supreme Court listens to maybe 100 cases a year, right? So that excludes, federal shenanigans or, emergency situations like this, right? And so I don't know if they realize that, they've just opened their own door or given the lower courts an invitation to give themselves more work, which I'm surprised that they have done that. But I think ultimately the expectation will just be that folks will recognize that if the case in question is similar to these types of cases, so they know, okay, as it pertains to presidential power, you're going to have to let it ride.
Yeah.
But if it relates to like state power or local power, maybe you can step in and make a ruling. But if it has anything to do with what the president is trying to accomplish, you're going to have to step to the side. And that is still, even as I'm saying that, that is still frightening.
And there was a lot of discussion about the Supreme Court even during President Biden's term when you had a lot of Democrats calling for him to pack the court. He didn't end up doing it, but given the circumstances today, is there a possibility that the next Democratic president may pack the court?
There have been arguments about packing the court since FDR. I think at this point, right? So before you and I were even possibilities. So I'm still not convinced that they would. It would make absolute sense for them to do so because if without it, it could be upwards of another 10 or 15 years that we'll be stuck with this ideological split. And it's not even a split, it's an ideological majority. 6-3, there is no competition.
Mathematically, the math isn't there for
Yeah.
Democrats to maybe have some of their desired outcomes with a lot of cases in the Supreme Court. But given that the Supreme Court is supposed to be this objective middle ground, we still do have the ideological differences of the court. Is that going to be something that we're going to have to continue to deal with? Because you notice in public opinion polling, there's a general distrust toward the court because there's that feeling that it's become partisan.
Well, yeah. I mean, so the reasoning for that is of course all of the expose journalism that happened towards the end of Trump's first administration, where found out that it wasn't necessarily him doing the research or anyone in his administration doing the research. He went to a third party group, the Federalist Society, who told him who should be appointed, and he just essentially appointed those people, which raised questions as to about who's really running the country, or is there are there shadow puppets, things of that sort. And so I think that is like the biggest concern. And so if they were to also expand the Supreme Court at minimum, they would have to try and secure 2 seats.
Yeah.
And and even then, right, that just raises it from 3 to 5, right? So it still would be a 5-6 split. And of course, just because you are appointed as a seemingly liberal justice doesn't mean that you could become conservative over time. I can't remember the name of the justice. I want to say it was Souter, but I don't think it was Souter. But there was a justice appointed by Daddy Bush, I think, with the expectation that he was going to be a conservative justice, but he ended up being a liberal justice. And so, once you're appointed, you're not necessarily beholden to the ideology or even the party. But we know with the current Supreme Court, we know at minimum that ACB and Brett Kavanaugh and also Chief Justice Roberts are, staunchly still in the Republican Party, and they're staunchly conservative. And so if at minimum, oh, and Clarence Thomas still definitely too, right? That, with these stalwarts still there, the introduction of even 2 more seats may not make a difference. But and even then, the president, everybody would have to be Democratic, and they would essentially would have to be clones of each other, because we know that having a majority of all of the federal branches of government doesn't necessarily mean that your agenda will be pursued.
So, how will this affect the president's agenda? Because, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of different cases have ended up in courts, in federal courts, as a result of Trump administration policy. So, does this just clear the road for him to move forward how he wants?
I would argue that it does, because the remedy that this ruling has suggested is that if you are targeted, if you are at risk of being caught up in whatever new program or whatever directive that exists from the Trump administration, your only remedy is to file a lawsuit. And so, you can do a class action lawsuit, and I found that interesting that they mentioned that in their opinions, because when you think of class action lawsuits, you think of daytime television and those commercials for if you were wronged, right?
Sure.
But to say that that's essentially the only option for folks that are targeted is to try and do this collective action thing. Also, it cheapens or weakens what the average person can do. And it makes things a lot more bleak and depressing for people, I would argue.
So, what incentive would exist then for the next president to try to roll back this change that has happened? Because presidents for years have wanted more authority and more consolidated power in the executive branch. So, would any future president be incentivized to change this way of doing things?
The answer is no. Pandora's box has been opened.
Yeah.
And that is kind of scary for me to say, but there is absolutely no political incentive to try and dial this back. Because if the next president, regardless of party ID, now knows that they have this carte blanche, am I really going to give up my free card so that, so that the government can work like it did back in 2020? No, 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 no. Instead, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure things are good. And I'm going to make sure that I do as much as possible to get all of these things done that I think the country needs. And we'll just continue to see that. The only way that we can see this dialing back of power is from Congress, because we cannot forget that a lot of the powers and responsibilities that the president has are delegated to that office by Congress. And so the only true check on presidential power as it exists currently is Congress. And the way to do that would be to take back a lot of those powers that they gave to the president. And I also don't see that happening, which is a shame, because if Congress actually did do that, it would be a great look for those elected members, especially in the House.
I think we just took a tour through all three branches of government in this conversation. It's crazy what a Supreme Court ruling can do to an interview. Dr. Brianna Mack, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.